Some individuals seem to glide from win to win, while others replay the same battles on a loop. And the harsh reason is that small frailties aren't harmless quirks, but stealthy saboteurs gnawing at momentum every day, turning potential into inertia through tiny concessions that accumulate into a posture of surrender that becomes a lifestyle rather than a momentary lapse. Because frailty is not a fixed personality feature but an elected stance taken repeatedly, which drains agency and seeds initiative to bolder actors who cultivate edge, posture, and outcomes. A pattern perfectly legible to Renaissance statecraft where appearances deceive crowds, while reality is reserved for the few who can see beneath the surface and act with precision, reminding that the world compensates leverage and execution rather than good wishes, and that a person who refuses to train power ends up training helplessness. So the agenda is simple. Expose the hidden scripts that keep power dormant, uninstall them, and replace them with strategy, boundaries, and decisive movement that compels respect rather than requests it. Because a mask fools onlookers while results persuade rivals, and a firm standard backed by consequence travels farther than a pleasant story ever will in any arena that matters. Weakness is not native to the mind but layered on early, through well-meaning conditioning that mistakes compliance for virtue, teaching constant apology, reflexive self-betrayal in the name of harmony, and deference to permission structures that keep ambition caged until the cage becomes comfortable furniture. So a day begins with borrowed priorities from a screen, progresses with unchosen commitments financed by resentment, and ends with silenced wins to soothe the insecure, which trains a person to dodge friction until small issues metastasize into crises, while classic strategy insists that survival requires two complementary modes: the alert cunning that sees snares forming, and the imposing presence that makes predators reconsider their appetite, a duality neglected by those trained to be edible rather than elusive and formidable. And the most potent lie in this conditioning is that self-respect is selfish. Standards are cruel and aspiration is greed, even as the architects of that lie quietly leverage sharp standards and cold clarity, which means the first breakthrough is suspicion of inherited rules. Does this belief advance the mission or shrink it? Does the advice protect long-term outcomes or shield someone else from discomfort at the cost of another's future? And when growth reshapes identity, the correct response is a nod, not an apology. In competitive environments, there are only two effective roles: actors who shape terms and those who accept leftovers, and unguarded soft spots are bright beacons to opportunists who scan for pliable targets, which is why an organization's recognition gravitates not to the quiet grinder, but to the person who frames value in public, aligns with leverage points, and ensures their contribution is undeniable. While in personal dynamics, the leverage belongs not to the one who clings hardest, but to the one ready to step back rather than tolerate erosion. Because telegraphed pliancy invites incremental boundary testing until tolerance becomes tacit consent. Meetings become places where opinions can be ignored without consequence. Calendars get commandeered, and goals become punchlines in the mouths of spectators who sense there will be no defense. And respect follows the same rule in every arena. People value what resists effortless control and discount what yields without cost. Which is why classic counsel on fear versus love has been misread as a license for cruelty when the functional lesson is about reliable deterrence, namely that boundaries guarded by credible consequence earn steadier regard than charm alone. So the task is not menace but unmistakable clarity. Lines exist, and crossing them has a price. Accepting slights without response is a training program administered to onlookers. Broadcasting that mistreatment is free. Hesitation is exploitable, and nerves can be pulled like wires to make predictable choices. And once that pattern is learned, the halo of respect collapses even among beneficiaries of the imbalance who privately disdain the very softness they exploit. So a better creed is simple and unashamed. Choose dignity over applause, substance over ease, and standards over approval, because approval is rented while dignity is owned. And in practice, that means refusing to bargain away time to chronic oversteppers, refusing to subsidize derision with silence, and refusing to make oneself small so that fragile egos can feel tall, which rewires a social environment more quickly than polite speeches, since most people recalibrate instantly to credible standards in the same way citizens obey clear laws backed by consistent enforcement. A point echoed in old political theory where reliable consequence stabilizes behavior more effectively than affection, that dissolves under pressure, making it plain that a posture of firm, humane strength sustains order, earns guarded trust, and prevents the spread of casual disrespect before it takes root and becomes culture. Comfort is a velvet trap that exchanges growth for ease, leaving skills underloaded, courage undertrained, and horizons underexplored until a half-decade passes with the same job, the same unspoken conversations, the same careful excuses, and the same shrunken expectations masquerading as prudence. Because potential decays in padded rooms while competence atrophies without resistance, confidence shrinks when no hard thing gets finished, and rare chances refuse to visit people who decline uncertainty. A cycle visible across time if one studies patterns rather than headlines, where avoidance taxes get collected with interest later in stale careers, exhausted bodies, brittle relationships, and lives that feel safe yet hollow. So the remedy is unfancy. Adopt discomfort as tuition for capability. Take the calls that raise pulse rate, tackle the talk that clears the fog, nail the move that looks daring to spectators but necessary to the strategist, and invest in capacity before capacity seems affordable. Because the future discounts boldness taken early and punishes timidity disguised as patience. And as discomfort becomes habit, the world grows calmer because fewer storms feel existential when storm practice is daily. High performers share one unfashionable habit: acting before complete readiness and growing into the demands they created, which looks reckless to comfort addicts and looks obvious to builders who know that readiness is built, not found, so they choose stretching over stagnation repeatedly until challenge becomes normal calories. And that steady diet produces a nervous system that no longer flinches when stakes rise, which is exactly why life appears easier around them though their choices are harder. Because competence reduces chaos and earned confidence deletes dread, making room for clearer sightlines, cleaner boundaries, and swifter corrections when conditions shift. And a practical mantra fits this path well. Embrace useful discomfort as the tariff charged at the border of the next level. Pay it gladly, collect the passport stamp, and move again. Because waiting for certainty is secretly waiting for someone else to claim the prize while the cautious rehearse reasons. A phenomenon as old as any playbook on power and as current as any market where hesitation loses to momentum. 4. Soothing myths dismantle strength more reliably than overt opposition. Starting with the fairy tale that rewards show up for patient bystanders when in reality, spoils flow to initiators who manufacture timing rather than consult it. Followed by the belief that respect is a baseline entitlement, when genuine respect is the market price paid for visible value and clear standards. Then the slogan that authenticity alone magnetizes worthy allies, when the unedited version of a person can be a draft, whereas the refined, demanding version attracts those calibrated for excellence. And finally, the cosmic shrug that everything unfolds for mysterious reasons which excuses abdication and invites passivity. While the older literature on power warns that public image and private reality diverge, and that most will judge by surfaces, meaning a person must decide what signal to emit on purpose, instead of waiting to be defined by default. So the corrective posture rejects anesthetic stories and embraces practical, sometimes uncomfortable truths that put hands back on the wheel and choices back on the table where they always belonged. Most losses trace back to decisions made in hot blood and explained later with tidy logic, while most wins are born from cool calculation implemented with emotional discipline. So when disrespected, the reflex is anger, but the strategist asks which response advances position over the long arc. And when offered an opening, the reflex is doubt, but the strategist runs risk-reward math rather than feelings. And when nudged by manipulators, the reflex is self-questioning, but the strategist investigates incentives and expected value. Because reacting is automatic and often costly while responding is deliberate and typically compounding, and predictability becomes a leash in the hands of anyone who can press known buttons to extract expected behaviors, which is why energy allocation matters. Not every fire merits water, not every slight merits engagement, and not every provocation merits an audience. Since attention is a currency and focus is a fortress that collapses if every knock earns entry, leaving core aims underfunded while trivial battles feel heroic in the moment and hollow by month's end. Calculation turns chaos into a solvable game by forcing 3 questions before motion. What specific outcome is sought in this exchange? How does this move change position 6 months ahead? And is this friction a mission expense or a vanity purchase for the ego, which instantly filters out 80% of temptations and traps? And the old maxim separates the wise from the foolish. By tempo and order, plan then strike versus strike then explain. And that sequence matters because timing, without a model is just noise, while timing with a model is edge. And none of this mandates becoming icy or unfeeling. Since emotions are excellent sensors but terrible pilots, better read as dashboards that highlight motive, meaning, and urgency, while the steering remains in the hands of principles, probabilities, and pre-commitments, producing behavior that looks calm, not because feelings are absent, but because systems are stronger than impulses. A trait respected across courts and boardrooms and families alike, wherever outcomes beat theatrics and consistency beats charm. Practical rewiring begins small and compounds fast. Claim mornings for planning before feeds colonize attention. Rehearse no until it exits the mouth without apology. Define boundaries with explicit consequences and enforce them once to teach the lesson forever. Narrate contributions at work so value becomes visible rather than guessed. Cultivate walk-away power so negotiations occur on a real rather than imaginary field. And defend calendar blocks as fiercely as budgets. Because time is the asset that funds every other asset, and leakage there bankrupts everything else. And as this operating system takes hold, the prey script decays. Less placation, more clarity. Less permission-seeking, more initiation. Fewer explanations, better results, until the environment adapts or exits. And either outcome is a win, because misaligned dynamics cost energy that should be spent on building, learning, and compounding advantages that stabilize confidence without performance theater. The strategic posture worth emulating is a chimera. Sharp-eyed and soft-stepping when sniffing for wires in the grass, unmistakably imposing when enforcing lines in the sand. A blend discouraging to hunters and confusing to demagogues, which builds a reputation for steadiness that travels faster than rumor and reduces the number of times force is required because credibility does most of the work. And contrary to cartoonish readings, the doctrine is not cruelty but clarity. Act with restraint. Escalate only when necessary, be measured but not meek. And keep consequences consistent so others prefer cooperation to testing, since public judgment is shaped mostly by displays and very little by private nuance. A reality that rewards those who design signals intentionally and punishes those who leave impressions to chance. And that is why standards voiced plainly and applied evenly attract allyship and repel opportunists without speeches. A silent architecture of respect more durable than charisma. In the end, the frame is choice, not fate. Either allow inherited scripts to keep the engine idling or install a new program that prioritizes power, responsibility, and motion, and the installation steps are unfancy. Question every rule that shrinks horizons. Practice discomfort until it feels normal. Decline false myths that sing lullabies to potential. Trade tantrums for tactics. And keep score by outcomes rather than optics. Because life distributes rewards to those who decide decisively and sustain that decision through friction. A truth that has not changed from courts of princes to corridors of startups. And the invitation remains the same. Pick respect over approval, growth over ease, reality over theater, and calculation over impulse. Then defend those picks daily until the identity matches the standard and the environment concedes what it once resisted. Since most gates open for the person willing to knock with calm persistence and walk away when the price insults the mission. When feelings flare, they are messengers, not monarchs. They point to what matters, while measured analysis chooses how to move, which is the crucial inversion most repeat backward by letting a spike of anger or a rush of thrill steer the wheel and then wondering why outcomes loop in circles with the same bruises in new packaging. Because an insult met with immediate fury tends to harden opposition rather than resolve it. A job path picked in fear confines potential while pretending to protect it. And a dying relationship preserved for comfort merely extends pain on a payment plan. Whereas disciplined decision-making starts with a pause to translate emotion into signal, frames options by long-term advantage rather than short-term relief, and selects responses that compound position 6 months from now, instead of soothing pride 6 minutes from now. Making a simple creed useful. Emotions advise, calculations decide. Feelings articulate values. Strategy produces results. Sentiment sets priorities, structure executes them, and in practice, the shift from reaction to response transforms conflict, careers, and commitments because predictability in the face of provocation invites manipulation, while composure backed by clear standards and credible consequences invites respect. And the virtuosity here is not numbness but sovereignty. Feel fully, decide coolly, then act with precision that moves the scoreboard rather than the heart rate. An approach that turns heated moments into strategic pivots and alluring opportunities into vetted bets rather than expensive detours that only felt like destiny at the time. Attachment to a specific outcome drains negotiating power like a slow leak. The tighter the grip, the easier the read, and the more leverage migrates to the counterpart who recognizes need as a steering wheel. Approval hunger hands control to gatekeepers, singular job fixation hands terms to employers, and desperation inside intimacy hands tolerance to bad behavior that would otherwise meet a firm boundary. Which is why strategic detachment is not indifference but optionality, a stance that aims for the best, prepares for the rest, and refuses to let any single decision-maker hold the keys to the future. With multiple paths, primary, backup, and contingency, reducing anxiety, improving judgment, and elevating presence in every room. Because a person who can walk away chooses better terms and executes cleaner plays, and freedom from neediness is audible in tone, visible in choices, and contagious in how others treat time, attention, and standards. So cultivate alternatives before they are required. Maintain walkaway capacity even when a deal feels perfect, and organize life so no external stamp of approval is necessary for internal calm. Since peace sourced internally is the one currency that cannot be revoked by a memo, a mood, or a market swing, and with that foundation, action flows from principle rather than panic, from clarity rather than craving, and from strength rather than scarcity. Explanations offered to audiences committed to misunderstanding are subsidies for confusion. Justifications performed for people who won't wear the cost of the decision are performances without purpose. And apologies for occupying space are ritual self-erasure that teaches onlookers to expect less and demand more. So a better pattern is direct and quiet. Define standards. Enforce them consistently. Let results carry the narrative. And let silence protect oxygen for work rather than debate. Because status is not conferred by titles but by conduct that raises the meaning of any role, and the strongest presence rarely advertises itself. It is felt as the steady gravity that shapes the room, seen in the trail of outcomes that require no defense, and recognized in the refusal to trade long-term position for short-term applause, which means that a seasoned posture, calm spine, clear line, and credible follow-through becomes its own consequence, not aggression, not threat, simply reality that others must respect, adjust to, or exit. And in that posture, the need to perform toughness evaporates because toughness is embedded in standards. The need to insist on worth declines because worth is recorded in contributions. And the need to litigate choices vanishes because success is the closing argument that juries of peers and rivals both understand. Consider the architecture learned here as a replacement operating system rather than a set of tips. Frailty is not a cute trait, but a strategic handicap that bleeds advantage across domains. Cultural conditioning often wires that handicap early through scripts that equate compliance with goodness and comfort with wisdom. Ease when chronic quietly rots capability. Seductive myths. Patience without action, automatic respect, authenticity without refinement, and fate as excuse keep many in soft cages. Emotional reflexes need translation into calculated plays. Detachment restores leverage. And identity shifts from seeking permission to radiating consequence when standards meet consistency. None of this calls for cruelty, only clarity, clear boundaries, clear math, clear objectives. And the shift presents immediately in morning routines that prioritize planning over noise. In work that displays value without waiting to be discovered. In relationships renegotiated around mutual respect. And in negotiations conducted with options in the back pocket and stillness in the face. A suite of changes that compound into an aura, predictable only in principles, unpredictable in tactics, impossible to manage with cheap tricks. Practicality seals power, so embed tactics into days rather than moods. Begin by reclaiming undistracted time for high-impact planning before messages hijack agenda. Install a two-step response habit, pause to label the emotion precisely, then ask the single best outcome to aim for and select the smallest effective action that advances it. Deploy a 6-month filter on choices to kill compulsions that look righteous now, but wreck position later. Build a written option tree for major pursuits to ensure no single yes or no can sink the mission. Set explicit boundaries with pre-announced consequences and enforce once to teach forever. Narrate contributions succinctly and regularly, so value becomes legible and hard to appropriate. Cultivate walkaway power by lowering fixed costs and strengthening portable skills. and practice low-stakes no repeatedly until the word exits the mouth without decoration. Because each small reinforcement installs a habit, each habit writes identity, and identity dictates what opportunities appear doable and which rooms become inevitable, turning power from a posture into a process that runs even on low motivation days. Conflict, opportunity, and uncertainty act like amplifiers. They either broadcast reactivity or showcase composure. And the deciding factor is a personal protocol that routinizes good judgment. When provoked, treat anger as a smoke alarm and investigate the fire rather than swinging at the alarm. When enticed, measure upside against downside, probability against payoff, and cost of delay against cost of action. When pressured by scarcity, inspect whether the scarcity is real or manufactured by timeline games. When guilt trips arrive, calibrate responsibility to agreements rather than vibes. When flattery appears, assume there is an angle and search for the ask. And when stakes are truly high, widen the time horizon rather than shrinking it, because most traps look urgent and most opportunities look uncertain. And protocol is the equalizer that turns breath into space, space into thinking, thinking into sequencing, and sequencing into leverage that multiplies results while burning less energy than a life lived in perpetual firefighting. Detachment becomes easier when backs are covered by robust alternatives, so develop them intentionally. A portfolio of relationships across domains to dilute single-source approval. A lattice of capabilities that allows rapid pivots. A savings buffer that quiets panic in negotiations. A pipeline of opportunities at different maturities. And a habit of shipping work publicly enough to attract inbound interest. All of which transform posture from pleading to choosing. And in that shift, conversations reframe from, "help me," to, "here's the fit." Deadlines stop feeling like cliffs and start feeling like checkpoints. And the social ecosystem self-selects toward peers who appreciate clarity, reciprocity, and pace, while opportunists find little to grip. This is what older strategists meant by being nimble like the fox to detect traps and imposing like the lion to deter hunters, an integration of discernment and presence that makes entanglement rare and exploitation costly, thereby stabilizing life not by hiding from risk, but by designing for resilience and deterrence in advance. Stop feeding audiences of cynics with energy meant for execution, because misinterpretation by the committed is not a solvable problem, but a sinkhole. Instead, measure communication by necessity and effect. Inform stakeholders who bear costs and share rewards. Align with collaborators who move outcomes, and let spectators learn by watching the scoreboard change, where the public sees only appearances yet cannot deny consistent final tallies. In such an environment, titles look small next to throughput, ornament loses to impact, and nameplates bow to competence that makes any role prestigious by association, creating a loop in which quiet standards produce loud results. Loud results simplify future conversations, and simplified conversations free bandwidth to build further, compounding into a presence that others sense long before words arrive. The myths that tidy failure into comfort should be retired and replaced with stances that create motion. Waiting transforms to initiating. Entitlement transforms to earning. Raw authenticity transforms to refined excellence. And fatalism transforms to agency. These substitutions do more than inspire. They rewire incentives. Initiators attract allies and information. Earners negotiate from strength. Refined performers filter for compatible counterparts. And agents of their fate tolerate short-term discomfort to secure durable positioning. A trading rule that produces fewer regrets and more options. And because public perception often lags private transformation, patience is required to let the new operating system demonstrate itself through outcomes, after which the environment updates its expectations and begins to meet standards rather than test them, evidence that the program has taken hold and is running automatically. Everything converges on a simple, unglamorous practice. Choose standards, encode them into routines, protect them with consequences, scale them with systems, and let them speak. Do not ask for permission to use strength wisely. Do not apologize for outgrowing versions built for smaller games. And do not export control of mood, mission, or meaning to external arbiters whose incentives are opaque, because power well used looks like serenity. Boundaries enforced feel like kindness to the future self, and confidence rooted in proof feels like relief to teams and partners who crave predictability anchored in competence. And the result is a life less noisy and more decisive, less performed and more built, where rooms tilt politely toward the person who has done the work, carries the options, and projects the steadiness that keeps storms from becoming melodramas or setbacks from becoming identities. That person is the consequence others plan around, not by threat, but by consistency. If a single line is needed to carry forward, let it be this: emotions are honored as signals. Choices are governed by strategy. Attachment is exchanged for options. Softness is replaced with clarity, and respect is earned by standards that hold under friction. Because fortune rewards decisiveness paired with discipline, outcomes accumulate to those who act without panic and adjust without drama, and identity crystallizes around demonstrated principles rather than rehearsed slogans. Begin now with a small enforcement of a boundary, a single declined obligation that misaligns with the mission, a deliberate morning reclaimed from noise, an option created for a seeming single-path goal, and a calculated response where a reflex once lived. Then repeat until repetition becomes nature, and nature becomes reputation. For in the end, weakness is not essence but habit. Strength is not posture but practice. And the difference between the two is the daily choice to act like a strategist in a world that trains reactors.